Anybody that blatantly disregards classified information, well, they should be held accountable.
We want a commander-in-chief that understands the importance of protecting our secrets.
I still think that they're doing it deliberately so he can't run.
I'm deeply troubled to see this indictment move forward.
I'm Nicole Killian in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Former President Trump is now in Florida ahead of an historic court appearance on Tuesday. He is accused of mishandling classified documents and attempting to block the Justice Department's efforts to get them back. Over the weekend, Trump claimed he was the target of political persecution and called special counsel Jack Smith, quote, deranged. Multiple prominent Republicans have defended him in the wake of the indictment. For more on this, we're joined by Major Garrett, Scott McFarland, and Anthony Salvanto. Major is CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent. Scott is a CBS News Congressional Correspondent. And Anthony is CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys. Welcome to you all. I'm going to start with you, Scott. Set the scene as the former president prepares for his court appearance in Miami tomorrow.
At this moment, Nicole, the security is invisible. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, just means we can't see it. There's no barricades, no bike rack barriers, no shutting down of city streets. We expect that to change tomorrow. The courthouse behind me opens at 8:30 Eastern time tomorrow. They're going to let several hundred people in, but only about 20 of them will be permitted to sit in the courtroom itself, where Donald Trump makes that initial appearance and faces arraignment. This will be quick. The expectation is it's one of those hearings. If you blink, you miss it. It'll happen in about 10-15 minutes time. During the initial appearance, they will introduce the parties. During the arraignment, Trump would enter his not guilty or guilty plea. All expectations is it's not guilty. They'll talk about release conditions, and he'll be processed by the marshals. Attorneys who practice in this court frequently tell me there's actually an underground tunnel beneath where I'm standing where they can usher a defendant, Trump included, into the marshal's office, which is elsewhere in the city, across the street in a different complex. They also could take a private room or an office in the courthouse itself and earmark it for Donald Trump to be fingerprinted, to have his booking photo taken, to be formally introduced to his pretrial services officer. But all of this, Nicole, is likely to be invisible to the public. There are no cameras allowed in federal courthouses, certainly not in the courtroom itself. And it's likely, if not possible, Trump would be escorted to a private entrance. He will not walk in the front door behind me.
And Scott, very briefly, where do things stand with the former president's legal team? We know he had a big shakeup before heading down to Miami.
He has, as his lead attorney, the same attorney, Todd Blanche, who's representing him in that Manhattan prosecution of Alvin Bragg. He's been trying to add attorneys to the team, and the clerk of courts here in Miami sent a notification to the lawyers. They have to have somebody who is barred or licensed to practice here in the Southern District of Florida, somebody who is accepted by the Florida bar and by the local court rules. There is some time to get that done before tomorrow's initial appearance, but if for some reason they couldn't get it done, they couldn't get a local attorney of record who's approved for this court, they would have to forestall the arraignment to a different day, and presumably nobody in the defense team, perhaps nobody in the security team, wants to have the former president come back again a different day and go through all this again.
And Major, of course, as this legal process plays out, so does the political process. As you know, our Bob Costas sat down with Georgia Governor Brian Kemp a short time ago. We really haven't heard him weigh in on this indictment until now. Let's take a listen.
At the end of the day, the jury will be, render the ultimate verdict on that. But look, it is concerning, but I think also it's a distraction. It's distracting from what I think people need to be focused on in the presidential race. And I also think that there's a lot of people around the country, including myself, that are concerned about the fairness issue here on the federal agencies like the FBI and the Department of Justice.
What do you make of his response?
So it's very cautious, and it is consistent with some of the caution that some Republicans have voiced having read the indictment. There was a preliminary rush by Republicans to say it's all politicized, it's a wish hunt. Then the indictment came out and people said, oh, wait a minute. This looks highly detailed, very specific, with a list of evidence that I don't think many Republicans were expecting that detail and specificity to convey. So, of course, the jury will have the ultimate verdict on this. And is it a distraction? Well, of course it's a distraction. What Republicans don't want to answer is who's to blame for that distraction: the underlying conduct of former President Trump or the Justice Department. Now, there is this larger conversation that Trump has initiated and fed relentlessly, that if not for the politicized Department of Justice, none of this would be happening. He says over and over again in fundraising emails that if he were to plead or give in, all these charges would be dropped. That's not true. These charges would not be dropped. Whether you think they should be brought in the first place is a second question, but they would not be dropped. Former President Trump is going to be prosecuted on this case. He'll have his day in court, and the politics of it are still teasing themselves out. Just a few moments ago, on Fox, Nikki Haley, former governor of South Carolina, UN ambassador in the Trump administration, said the former president, if the indictment is true, was incredibly reckless. Incredibly reckless with the handling or mishandling of classified or sensitive information. That's moving in another direction. And I think you're going to see that trend line continue for Republicans as this case plays out and the specificity of it continues to impress upon them the gravity of these charges.
Yeah, certainly strong words from Haley there. And Anthony, I want to turn to you. The former president, of course, is telling his supporters to be strong, that they're going to defeat the so-called radical left. He says he's not dropping out of the race, that he won't yield. What does your polling reveal when it comes to some of his rhetoric?
So, Nicole, first of all, context. None of these events have done anything to shake Donald Trump's status as the front runner for the Republican nomination, at least at this early stage of the 24 race. A couple of reasons for that. One is how they see this case. I'm going to point to these big numbers behind me right here. Likely GOP primary voters are not seeing this as a potential national security risk if the alleged documents have things like nuclear and military specifications in them. The rest of the country at 80% does. So that's a big difference. The other thing I want to show you, though, is connection to Donald Trump and to your question about standing strong. The Trump voter right now, like those who aren't voting for him, wants somebody who is tough in a presidential candidate. But also, look at this difference. The Trump voters much more likely to want somebody who's demanding of loyalty. Yes, not a majority, but more likely to want somebody who's entertaining. And then also, they're more likely to want someone who is combative. And that's part of the rhetoric that you described. I would add this, Nicole. When we take a look at what the electorate wants Donald Trump to talk about, well, not everybody wants him to talk about these investigations that are going on, but MAGA Republicans, more likely to his voters, his base, does want that. Whether it extends beyond that is a question we'll have to follow.
And Scott, I know that you spoke to a lot of voters over the weekend as the former president addressed them both in Georgia and North Carolina, most of them sticking with the former president for now. But I do want to play a bit of sound from former Attorney General Bill Barr. Take a listen.
If even half of it is true, then he's toast. I mean, it's a very detailed indictment, and it's very, very damning.
I mean, those are pretty strong words from the former attorney general. He probably would know better than anyone else in terms of the nature of these charges. I mean, how hard will this be for the former president to beat?
I suspect the former attorney general knew just how compelling that quote would be, that he's toast. We're looking at a criminal case that might be measured in year or years, not day, weeks, or months. Federal case takes time. This is going to go well into 2024, and they haven't precluded this going into 2025, which is why I say years. Real quickly, we did speak to a veteran criminal defense attorney here in Miami who painted a picture for what criminal defendant Donald Trump faces here tomorrow.
When you are in the custody of the marshal, you are in their custody, which means you are not free to go. So you're cuffed, you're printed, you're photographed, and you're in their custody until you are done being processed.
We will see what political impact that has, Nicole.
All right, Scott, and then Major, to you. Obviously, you know, again, that's the part of the legal process here. But in terms of politically speaking, I want to play some sound from Carrie Lake, who also spoke over the weekend and remains defiant. Let's take a listen.
If you want to get to President Trump, you're going to have to go through me and you're going to have to go through 75 million Americans just like me. Most of us are card-carrying members of the NRA.
I mean, hypothetically, even if the former president is convicted, does this still embolden him as he goes down the path towards the 2024 race?
This is a classic example of Carrier Lake rhetoric, which is resembling and mimicking Donald Trump rhetoric. It's not a threat. If you parse that sentence, it's not a threat, but it leaves the implication that, remember, if this thing goes south and we're not happy, as card-carrying members of the National Rifle Association, let me be clear, there's nothing wrong about that. The implication of violence hangs over that statement. Carrie Lake loves that because she knows the reaction will be, oh my God, it's a threat. It's not a threat, but it carries the implication of it. And Carrie Lake is an interesting person to talk about this right now because Carrie Lake is an election denier, full stop. She denies that she lost the 2022 governor's race, which she did. She denies Trump lost the 2020 election, which he did. And that denial carries now over into whether former President Trump did anything wrong, or even questions should be raised about whether he did anything wrong. These two things run in parallel. Denialism of election reality and now denialism of legal realities. The legal jeopardy former President Trump faces is real. He will have his day in court. He will have the adversarial process at his side, as every defendant in America does. But that doesn't mean the allegations aren't serious, and the implications, both legal and political, are not serious as well.
All right, Major Garrett, Anthony Salvanto, and Scott McFarland, thanks so much for joining us. Former President Trump's allies and critics on Capitol Hill continue to battle over the federal indictment. We'll ask South Carolina Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace for her reaction next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. The federal indictment of Donald Trump is already playing out politically, with a majority of Republicans in Washington already defending the former president. South Carolina Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace joins us now. She is a member of the House Oversight Committee. Congresswoman, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
You've said that Joe Biden wants to give Donald Trump a, quote, death sentence over these classified documents. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, when you're facing hundreds of years over the handling or mishandling of documents, that's a death sentence. He wants him to spend the rest of his life in jail. There's no other way to describe that. And for me personally, looking at this and what's happened, the moment that we got access to the suspicious activity reports, he got indicted in New York. The moment that we got access to a 1023 document provided by the FBI showing bribery between the current president and his son, Donald Trump gets indicted again. I think that a lot of people are seeing it for what it is, whether he mishandled the documents or not. The timing of it, to take out your political opponent, the executive branch trying to take out your political opponent during a presidential campaign, isn't lost on most of America.
Speaker McCarthy has also suggested there's a double standard at play. Here's what he told me when I asked him about the former president's handling of classified documents.
But what about those pictures? What about those pictures? Was that a good look for the former president to have boxes in a bathroom?
I don't know. Is it a good picture to have boxes in a garage that opens up all the time? A bathroom door locked. So, look, I don't want people to take these documents away, the vice president, Pence, but as a senator, you have to steal the documents.
So even if you agree with the speaker, is it appropriate for the former president to have boxes stacked up in his bathroom, his ballroom, and other places? I mean, taking President Biden out of the equation, does that concern you?
Well, I mean, he had boxes everywhere. And to my understanding last year that the FBI had access to Mar-a-Lago. They had access to the boxes at various points. I can't imagine that all those boxes had classified information in it. But the president of the United States is the only person who would be allowed to take records with him or her when they left the White House. And when I look at the garage, I look at Vice President Biden's garage, as a senator or as a vice president, you don't have the authority to do that. You certainly don't as a Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, to have classified information on your private email server in your private home. So that's why I think the majority of Americans see that there is a double standard. I think we can argue all day about whether or not a former president should handle documents in this manner. I think that it's totally up for debate and a conversation we should be having. But whatever the standard is, then everybody needs to be treated the same way. Hillary wasn't treated the same way. She was a presidential candidate in 2016. Based on Comey's reporting, they're possible that foreign agents from China and Russia got access to that server, and there was no accountability for it. I mean, they literally took hammers to cell phone devices and iPads. They did BleachBit, a program to wipe out her server, and nobody was ever held account for that. So if that's the standard, then everybody's got to be held to the standard.
I mean, to that point, you also tweeted that Hillary Clinton used a hammer, as you just mentioned, to destroy evidence of a private email server and classified information on that server, and was never indicted. And as you just said, the same standard should apply to everyone, including former President Trump. That being said, your former colleague, Congressman Adam Kinzinger, responded to you saying this is literally untrue, and you know it. You're better than that. How do you respond to Congressman Kinzinger?
Well, Keith Olbermann did the same thing, and there was the Twitter community notes that fact-checked Olbermann on that. In fact, it was Hillary Clinton's, their devices. They used a hammer to destroy phones and also iPads. They used a program called BleachBit, which wipes out and cleans off servers off of Linux and Windows servers, which they use to destroy evidence. Some would call that obstruction of justice. And so the facts are actually on my side. And I know that it may not be easy for the left to admit that's what happened, but that is actually what happened. That's on record. And the other thing that people are forgetting is that agents of China and Russia had access to her server. They never determined that they got access to classified information on the server, but I would imagine the chances were pretty high. And so if that's a standard for someone who wasn't even president, that was the Secretary of State, and there was no indictment, then that's the standard. But I do think it's critical that we have this conversation. We've seen Mike Pence, we've seen Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton. They all left their jobs, their offices with classified information and shouldn't have had that, shouldn't have been able to do that. I know as a member of Congress, if I'm caught with classified information outside of a SCIF, I'm breaking the law. That's what the law is as a member of Congress.
And then just very briefly before we let you go, as you know, there's an impasse right now between Speaker Kevin McCarthy and some members of the Republican conference, more specifically some members of the House Freedom Caucus. Do you expect a resolution this week?
I'm hopeful that we get a resolution this week, but I said early on during the speaker's fight that it was really important to have transparency, to shine sunlight on whatever negotiations were going on, whatever gentlemen's handshakes were being made in back rooms, have it in writing for all of Congress and all of the public to see so that there's no mistake on whatever deals were made. That's part of being in Congress, is negotiating with your colleagues on both sides of the aisle. But I wish it had been in writing. I wish we'd all seen it so we all know what place we're operating from so we can move forward. The American people are facing inflation. They're facing the cost of everything continuing to rise, especially after the debt ceiling bill that will only increase government spending. We got a lot of work to do up here, and I'm ready to get started.
All right, Congresswoman Nancy Mace, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Candidates for the 2024 presidential election are hot on the campaign trail. We'll have more on the GOP race and what candidates are saying about former President Trump and President Biden after the break. You're streaming America Decides.
If this indictment is true, if what it says is actually the case, President Trump was incredibly reckless with our national security. More than that, I'm a military spouse. My husband's about to deploy this weekend. This puts all of our military men and women in danger if you are going to talk about what our military is capable of or how we would go about invading or doing something with one of our enemies.
Welcome back to America Decides. That was GOP presidential candidate Nikki Haley criticizing former President Trump's indictment. Other GOP candidates on the campaign trail are also weighing in. CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe joins me now. And Ed, just want to get your thoughts on Haley's characterization that she thinks the former president was reckless.
She seems to be going there now and being far more critical and outspoken in her concerns about this, pointing out, as we've known for a few weeks, that her husband is indeed deploying this weekend with the South Carolina National Guard, but trying to put herself at distance from him now that the content of the accusations is out there. We should point out, however, before she says that in that interview, she does what just about every other Republican presidential candidate has done in recent days, and that is either revive or start their own criticisms about how the Justice Department and the FBI writ large have been investigating the former president.
What do you think is the strategy behind that?
The Republican base simply thinks that they're being unfair to the former president, and that they have aggressively targeted the Republican frontrunner, former president, more so than President Biden or Hillary Clinton, as you just heard in your conversation with Congresswoman Mace. That speaks to a real concern that a lot of base voters have about it. That said, to hear her, Nikki Haley, go out there and now say, if it's true, it's quite serious and we should be concerned about it. To hear Tim Scott earlier today in a quick conversation with reporters at an event he held in South Carolina say something very similar is a sign that a bunch of these candidates who, let's face it, are far further down in the rankings than the former president right now, realize that one way to get ahead potentially is to put distance between them and these accusations against them.
How does that square with other candidates, though, like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis?
He has also suggested that there's been a, quote, weaponization, unquote, of the Justice Department, a pretty aggressive characterization of where he thinks things are at. Has not weighed in as much on the specific charges, and I suspect he's going to get asked about it again at some point soon, and we'll see how he responds. But, you know, there are those like DeSantis who are trying to hug as close to, if not the former president himself, then to his policies, his style, and his base of support, than other candidates who perhaps are making a play for the more traditional Republican voter. That would certainly be Nikki Haley and Tim Scott. And they understand that there's a big segment of the party, or people who at least have associated with it in the past, who believe that what they're seeing here in this indictment is pretty serious.
And what about President Biden and Democrats and their reaction? I mean, I know the president has been reticent to weigh in on this, but given what you just said in terms of the characterization of the Justice Department, I mean, how can he keep his distance without looking like his Justice Department is involved? I mean, how does he straddle that line?
Keep his head down and keep away from anything that would suggest he's involved or monitoring it in any way. Refused to say last Friday when he was at, Thursday at two different events it was Friday, he was asked twice during stops in North Carolina whether he had any comment on it, whether he talked to the Attorney General. He said no comment. Today in the briefing,
but is that enough?
Well, no, well, we don't know. But what they have said since day one, what he said as a candidate was, I'm not going to weigh in on specific cases at the Justice Department. I'm not going to do anything that would suggest politicization of federal prosecutions. And so he's avoided bringing it up himself. When asked, we'll see how he comments. But even today at the briefing, they wouldn't say whether he's read the indictment at the suggestion of the special counsel, Jack Smith, who has told all Americans they should read the indictment for themselves.
And do you think those concerns will stand out more if Biden ends up opposing someone other than Trump?
We'll see. Who is it and how aggressively do they potentially raise the issue of, as they call it, the weaponization or the politicization of the Justice Department and the FBI? Remember, DeSantis and others have said that FBI's top leadership has to be cleaned out. In her statements today, Haley was suggesting that the entire federal justice system has to be reconsidered. I mean, those are pretty aggressive stances to take, but it speaks to the anger that a lot of voters, or at least the skepticism that a lot of Americans have about how the Justice Department and the FBI are being run.
All right. Ed O'Keefe, thank you so much for joining us as always. And of course, we will see you tomorrow evening when Ed actually anchors America Decides. He will be right here for you. For now, that will do it for us today. You can, of course, stream America Decides Monday to Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern. You are streaming CBS News.